I can see.
Beautiful. Okay. Glad to hear that that's working. So effectively just a minor tweak in the privacy, but if you have been wanting to review our past calls, particularly we tend to record our governance calls, but there are a handful of special topics or targeted topics on the profiling side of things that we do offer recordings for as well. So the playlist URL is in the chat if you want to spend your Thanksgiving weekend going through some of the kind of past decisioning and past discussions we've had. The other items we have on the agenda today, the last time we met for profiling, we started to explore this imposed profile extension. So we, outlined kind of how it worked and some of the decisioning around how it's applied that I think we still need to make like decisions and assess the differences and kind of closed last week's call or 2 weeks ago the call confirming it would be helpful to kind of actually pulley this against some of the expected constraints that tend to be distributed across profiles that we might encounter in the base or the core. So we knew and could feel comfortable about the decision about whether or not to utilize this kind of additional conformance tool or conformance like boon that's available to us. The last thing I want to make sure we continue kind of down the path for is like working through our community issue log items. We've had a handful of additional items come through in the last couple of months that we haven't had a chance to actually make decisions on. And I thought it might be helpful to also do a really quick walkthrough of how folks, if you're interested in like raising your hand on tackling really easy ones, how you can go through the process of co-editing and putting in a pull request, because there are some really, really easy ones in there that we'd love to be able to get in. But we've got a lot in the hopper that we've already kind of actioned, and we just need the help in getting those changes into the repository of profiles. Is there anything on this agenda that folks were expecting to see that you're not seeing right now? Okay. So I'm just going to give a high level recap because we loaded the slides up to OwnCloud and we had the recording from the last imposed profile discussion. But essentially, one of the kind of assets that's available to us now in the form of an extension is this imposed profile extension, which is essentially an assertion, but our validation tooling like FHIR Validator and eventually the validation tooling and things like FHIR Simplifier also has the ability to incur additional expectations on an instance where this extension is where this extension is applicable. And what we were trying to determine is, is this an asset that would be helpful to us in trying to describe where the base and the base rules should be applied within the landscape of profiles that we can expect. So essentially for folks that, hadn't heard the conversation last time, the imposed profile extension would be applied, let's say, in an example on the PSCA, the Pan-Canadian patient summary profile for patient. And it imposes, and it points to the target profile that it's trying to add additional rules for. So in our case, it might paint to a core. And what we discussed in previous weeks is, does it also have to point to a base if those rules are already kind of being enforced somewhere within that stream? So I have a depiction, and this is the one we were kind of talking through last week. And then I like played out a little bit of a scenario to describe kind of how it effectively works. But the idea is that it executes a secondary round of validation of an instance against anything that the impose profile extension targets. So in our example, you've got this kind of instance in purple, right? And you've got, let's just like thinking about this simply. Let's say you've got a example national use case profile, and it imposes a national core profile as well. What that would mean is any rules that you have here, plus any rules that you have here, would be required to be met by this instance, so the actual record that you're validating, in order for this instance to be valid against the host. So the example here, where there's no conflicts, like the simple example is, let's just say you've got a national use case profile, and the expectations are, supply one identifier. Doesn't say what type, but you just have to have an identifier and you have to have a value. And that identifier should either have a type, a system, or a signer. When my instance says, yeah, I meet those rules, there is a secondary step of validation that's performed that checks, does it also meet this rule? And if our core identified a slice requirement that a national identifier is met, that means that that type that I've supplied needs to at least have a national identifier. So in this case, because I've supplied an identifier, I've supplied a type, that type is a national identifier, and it's, provides system information, I meet these rules. And that's a valid, that's an instance that is considered conformant to this profile. Like before we talk about like the additional flows, there are questions on like that simple view. Let's just say you could make it even simpler by just saying this. Without any of the other parents, these are the rules. Does that make sense for like the hard constraints that do end up getting applied, even if they're not claimed in the profile that the instance is trying to claim conformance to? I see a plus from Frederic. So in this one, I've added in kind of an expected derivative relationship because, where there's an international use case, we typically like to be able to show the derivation at the national level. When we looked at what's the impact of having a core that's imposed and also having a base that's imposed, these are examples that we actually, I think, use in our base today that this instance would still be compliant with. So if you had an instance that had this identifier that with a type that was national and it had this system, it would effectively meet all of the rules that are like essentially inherited from this structure where we use derivation and impose profile in combination. And the application of impose coming off of the core versus impose coming off of the national use case profile doesn't really matter, because the idea is the sum total of these parts is met by the instance. Does that piece make sense to folks? Where it's like, as long as your rules don't conflict with each other, this instance effectively is inheriting and meeting all of those example expectations. Is there another, like, does anyone want to spend like another example on this? Like when there is no conflicts and everything works out nicely.
Yeah. So just with my limited understanding and knowledge. So as you mentioned, the imposed profile, so the national identifier slide basically just to identifying this is Canadian. So we will determine something as an identifier, or it will vary.
This is, yeah. So really this could be like, this is an example national core. So it's based off of what we're seeing in other places, but this could be like a JHN in our case.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Good catch. Yeah. Because ultimately, like, this is something we actually have a slice for and something that we might expect, like, there is consistency and rules around in a base or a core.
So we will determine, or we will have at least identified in each profile, which will align with all the different profiles basically, right?
Yeah, so the impose provides like an insight into what are the additional profiles that you're saying, you've gone through and you've checked, and the rules like that you've applied and your expectations align with the combination of these two. The other pattern that like is possible, but I think we'd have to discuss like whether or not it you get the same value out of it, is by like having all of your rules that are downstream present already in this profile. So typically we try to think about things from a differential point of view, where you're basically like, well, I don't have to restate what IPS cares about. I just have to state what's different from like what's been added from my national profile. And for that reason, we typically don't apply additional rules, or we don't apply rules that we inherit from other places. The only thing I think that as a community we have to start exploring is like will our users be confidently able to see like the rules that you're saying are imposed and you don't have to claim them, or do we introduce a confusion if like there's not a clear cut rendering that shows like the sum total parts? So that's, I think, something we don't have the answer for yet, but should be considered in how we use this and how we provide guidance in using this. Because ideally you'd be able to like, let me see if I can pull up Simplifier real quick. Go into your differential, right? And just see like the sum, or maybe it would be like go into your hybrid, see the sum total of what your expected rules are that are inherited across all those distinct kind of linked profiles at this point. But we don't have that yet. We'd have to ask for it. So we look at one example that would be like a conflicting example.
I needed to get to this so I can unmute. So a question is, if we don't have, because if we're inheriting and building something localized off of a implementation guide, say the Canadian IPS.
Yep.
If we aren't able to create a snapshot package with all of the inherited rules, can we still do that?
Can we still, so are you asking can or should?
Well, I think we should. That's my opinion.
Yep.
And can, because we were talking about just seeing the differentials, and that's so. I'm thinking about the difference between the human consumption and the computer consumption. I think we need to consider both.
So I think the way that the validation is working today allows for, so like when we process a profile in a package, oftentimes we start with just defining what's in the differential, and then when it gets packaged, the snapshot gets added. I think that the validation against imposed profile checks the snapshots of these, but doesn't create a merged snapshot view of this. So it checks the snapshots in the referenced packages, but it doesn't impact like what gets written back to the snapshot of this host. That's my current understanding, and it's still very early.
We'll have to sort of think through it and make sure that we know the impacts. That was my only thought point there.
Yep. So the machine and human impacts. And validation of the profile. Is it fair to say that like it would be desirable as potential users of this tool or this extension, that it would be desirable for us to have them like reflected in the hybrid view of our tools, even if what it actually looks in the back end isn't done one way or the other? Like we would want to see all of the rules put together.
I have mixed feelings about that.
Yeah, I was going to go both ways. In some ways, if I put my developer hat on, I want just one place to go to know the constraints I have to develop too. But I also understand where Elliot's coming from with mixed feelings. So again, this is the first time I've tried to apply thought to it. So I don't know what my personal conclusion is.
I'd have to agree with that. I can see seeing them together being beneficial, but still knowing where they come from.
And really, if
Elliot?
seeing it all together was very important to you and you felt it was important to your readers, you could just define your profile to include all of that stuff in its differential as well.
So Elliot, just to clarify, do you mean basically redefining the constraints to match, or?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I have mixed feelings about those approaches too, because we get diversion things over time. So
Yeah.
I'm interested in the rest of your mixed feelings though, Elliot, because you're thoughtful about these things.
Well,
That approach.
the author has made a decision to do it by using this impose profile extension rather than actually re-implementing all of the constraints. So they have chosen not to include it in the differential and to separate out those requirements. So while in terms of implementing it, you may be interested in knowing about the cumulative effect, the way the author has chosen to express it is as separate.
And is that not why we have differential and snapshot views? So we can have the snapshot when we need the whole thing and have the differential to see where the author went.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when we're gonna build another IG profile off an existing package, we then need the snapshot view. So the snapshot view may be more for computability than it is for communication to humans.
I wasn't sure. I don't think that I heard that the snapshot actually is a combined snapshot. I think it's just the snapshot of your profile with that extension in there that says, hey, when you get around to validating this, validate what's in this structure definition, and then validate what's in this other one as well.
Okay.
And so like, I'm trying to think out, like, I'm trying not to box myself in with this idea that like something has to show up in a snapshot in order for it to be rendered in what we see when it's in the snapshot view. But like, is there anything that we can definitively say, well, maybe it should at least kind of operate like this so that we could actually try to promote this in a way that is good for our human readability and machine readability?
Yes, there probably is. Like I said, I'm just beginning to think about this.
So Elliot, your con that you mentioned, which is like, I think it's that like there can be variation because it's within an author's control about whether or not they reiterate on the rules that are also shared in other places.
Well, I mean, in part, it's again, the value of the differential is, hey, this is what I'm adding to what you previously would have to do. And I wonder if that's useful for carrying through even into the snapshot view, where you say, this is what this profile imposes, and we're not going to layer it in with what another snapshot imposes. I also, my understanding with Graham is that one of the reasons why he went this route, rather than doing actual true multiple inheritance, is that coming up with a combined snapshot is actually very difficult. Because the two profiles can be sliced in or profiled in completely different ways. And figuring out what the combined set of constraints on them results in is very challenging.
And even outside of slicing, like let's say two profiles had, this is example, or this is preferred terminology when rendering in a snapshot view, right? There's just like one place. You could maybe say additional binding, but it's likely that even if you're not breaking a rule, but trying to merge all of the combined rules when there are differences, isn't possible in the structures that we have available within Snapshot today. And so, yeah. But like, I think that we have the ability to at least say, you know, as a developer, this is what would make it easier for me to navigate this pattern. Like, this is what I need to be able to see. And I think we're a good candidate for trying to say, okay, if we think we're going to have these rules distributed across a couple different places, here's some example scenarios to kind of throw at that. This was a non-conflicting. I'm wondering, maybe I just want to show a conflicting one and see if it changes folks' opinions on kind of, you know, whether or not like we'd have an opinion one way or the other. So this would be like if we all were looking at each other's guides and we were staying kind of in, oh, sorry, we were staying in sync and ensuring that we don't introduce rules in the chain that would be problematic. This is a potential conflict that might be more common because like when you start seeing distribution across, you know, a use case profile and a core profile. So, you know, in this example, you have a use case profile that says, I want patient name given and patient name family, or give me a data absent reason, right? Like I want the structured data and I have a rule around getting the structured data or DAR. And a core, which, you know, may have lesser expectations than the collection of information for a particular use case, might just say, I care about name.txt being present. And when an instance says, yeah, I conform to this profile that requires that either given or and name or DAR be present, I'm giving you given and family. This imposed profile would actually negate the ability to conform to this because this instance doesn't include name text. So these are the types of scenarios we have to be very careful to avoid and be thoughtful, even in the simple scenario where you only have one pointer of imposed profile to something else. Do we think that this would be kind of like, when we think about the types of rules that are present, at least in the base today, they tend to be much more like this or this or this, if we're going to put a shall on, like if we're going to put an invariant in play. Do we think that this is a reasonable concern that this could happen frequently in a base or a core?
I missed something because I don't see those two rules as conflicting.
They aren't at the profile level, but if the instance only conforms to this and doesn't conform to both, then it would be considered non-conformant to this.
So,
Yes.
so you're saying if you've got given name and family name, you might not have filled in name.txt,
Yep.
right?
So maybe it's conflicts might not be the way of saying it. It's more like scenarios where like the sum total may not be met.
Well, then you're non-conformant.
Mhm.
And by saying that your profile imposes this other one, you're saying you do have to be conformant with both.
And there would be a risk if your user wasn't able to see the summation, developing their instances that only met, you know, 1/2 of the rules.
Because if you knew the summation and you were filling in the granular elements, you could then also complete the name.txt, but you'd have to know that that was expected. In this example, this is a pretty simple example, but it brings forward the issue.
But in my mind, looking at this, when you put this impose through, shouldn't it say that the end result's supposed to have both the patient name given, patient name family, and the patient name text? Otherwise, you're not actually conformant to the rules, because
Well,
they're not
that's what
talking about the
this-
same place,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, but that's what this says. That's true. But it depends. But if you don't have the whole view of where it all is, and you're filling in the granular elements, then you end up missing the requirement for name.txt.
The other flavor of this is, this is a wild version because I'm going to use the DAR. Patient name equals DAR. Like where I meet this rule, but that rule is not like I'm providing something that explicitly breaks this rule as well. So it's not that text was, well, it kind of is that text was missing. Maybe, is there a better example of one that would be like a true conflict?
Patient name given shall be present, and patient name given shall not be present.
Oh, yeah. So. That one's kind of extreme. I think it'd be way more likely that that would happen if it was like hidden upstream somewhere.
I think the place where it might happen more commonly might be in addresses when we go with combined addresses versus granular addresses like address line 1, etc. Because some of our backstream systems have specific rules about things like address line 1 versus, an address block and then city, postal code, those kinds of things. That might be an area where it's these kind of conflicts might come up more easily.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be more like an implementation level profile that would have like a more strict rule on address.
Sure.
Sure, potentially.
So what would be
And
that
then it-
example?
Then it
Address
gets
line-
interesting when we start applying search parameters to those. But anyway, so let's say that we got a profile that's expecting at a minimum address line 1, city, province, postal code. And then we've got, and I forget the field where you put the combined address in, if all you have is just address text. And then you got another one that's, address.txt. Yeah, I've forgotten. I'm sitting in my car looking at my iPad, so I can't look it up. And you've got another profile that's expecting it not broken out into separate line items. It's just expecting a block address for the civic address and then city, province, postal code.
like patient address text. like that.
Yeah. I'd have to be sure that patient address text is actually an element. But
It is, yep.
Yep.
So in this scenario, you've got an implementation profile that expects structured data. And in this one, you've got one that expects text. I think it's similar to the one we looked at before, which is like, this is additive, and if the additive isn't met, but is it ever that the implementation profiles would actually not allow for text to be present?
I expect some will now. Some of them will take text as long as you also have the granular elements, but the ones that need the granular elements will reject it if it's just text.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and you're right, it is similar to the name thing you were starting with before. I was just thinking this might be more commonly occurring.
No, I think it's a good point. Like, do we think this would ever be reversed, where patient address text would be the thing in the implementation profile, but then like a downstream profile would have more structured expectations? I mean, I think it creates the same problem, which is if you don't meet all of those, it's a problem. I think, would it ever be like, would there be a place where we would say you can't send text in like another field that would be structured typically?
Codable concept, but don't send text.
Yeah, although I don't think I can't. That is a great example. I hope we don't do that very often, because most of our codable concepts we do need to be able to devolve to text if we have to.
Yeah, well, that's the whole reason it's there.
Yeah.
Is there another one then that would be like, or like maybe text isn't a good example? I think
the
maybe
more
it might.
common problem
Go
I'll
ahead.
run into is with different code sets. Like one requires a SNOMED code for something, the other requires a light code for something. That kind of a thing.
Or even, two codes from the same code system, but one from one value set, one from a different value set.
Yeah.
Different non-overlapping value set.
And are they in the same hierarchy or not? And all of those questions.
A lot of other cascading issues from it, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think that sort of thing is why Graham doesn't want to get into doing combined snapshots. And wants to stick with, let's validate this profile, okay, and now we're going to move on to another different profile and validate against that.
Yeah, I can understand that as you think through it.
So I think that it will almost like, to do this well, whatever the imposed profile that you're pointing to almost like has to operate at a level that is, substantially less restrictive than the host, in order to ensure that from an authoring standpoint, we aren't creating these issues. And I don't think that the solve should be make this implementation profile less specific.
Just regarding, as I mentioned, carried message from Graham, and I can only talk from a little bit different perspective. Yes, you can do that. Just go to the either profile to do the conformance test, as long as two profiles are statistically independent. However, if there's any correlation, especially from whatever element invariance perspective exist between these two profiles, then the issue might emerge, especially sometimes from rule set perspective, the sequence is crucial. If you think about security, if you put up a rule set for the security, if you give it a different order, the result might be success or disaster.
Do we think that?
I
Go ahead.
sorry, I don't quite understand what you mean there. Could you just go through it again?
Well, for example, here in the previous IPS discussion, they talk about the still roll back to the observation that discussion, which is not a very typical case. In the observation, they have two sections, right? One's the value set, one the component. You can either pick up one. And if you put the value set, you pick up the string value X as a mass port, how to set up that invariant. Eventually, they decide to get rid of that, that invariant. But actually, the original the invariant is put inside. There's kind of logic issues there, so they cannot pass through the validator, but just give them warning, not error message. That's good. But actually, what I talk about here, now we have this example here. Yes, we're talking about the data elements, but also the invariance behind the data elements. So now from FHIR perspective, we're talking about it from a different directional angle. That's what I said. You talk about the data elements, you talking about the invariance. Can we talk about those two factors independently? No, we have to talk about in one entity. And that now to say, wow, and you have two profiles. You put one conformance first, you put a second one, impose second conformance test or validation. Then you give manually you dictate the order, right? You dictate the order. So we go to profile 1 first, go to profile 2 second. The order been raised here. And if you go to another one, different per implementer, you go to profile 2 first. You go to profile 1 second. Then the result might be different. I only talk about a very specific case, but actually I should go to find some example, but I haven't chance to look at the details. But again, if you go back to the software engineering perspective, you go to the inheritance, the tree from 2 classes to multiple classes. Eventually, I do think, from my very short understanding knowledge, they all should be reflected in the one that snapshot. That's where the base, the foundation, where it's supposed to be, as a definition, snapshot supposed to be self-sustainable, one-stop, and profile. Just stop here. Thank you.
Rita, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, is what you're trying to do here really to derive your IG from 2 different profiles? So you're deriving it both from the international use case and you're deriving it from the national core profile?
Correct.
Wouldn't it be easier just to sort of be able to do that?
So as it stands, you can't actually derive from 2 distinct profiles. And when we explored, well, could you just put a national core somewhere in the hierarchy? It doesn't quite work, because typically the idea is that there are going to be rules from your international use case that are never going to be implemented into your national core, and vice versa. There are going to be rules from a national core that would never go into an international use case.
That's fine, but you want both of them in your example profile, right?
Yes. And so this is like what the FHIR community has proposed as a mechanism for multi-inheritance, when you can actually derive from 2 distinct things.
So, as an example for this, we've got a national patient profile, and it says they need a jurisdictional health number. There's also IPS, which is out there, and it exists, and it profiles other things on patient. For non-IPS use within Canada, we have no need of those IPS constraints on patient. IPS has no need for the Canadian jurisdictional health number as part of their international profile. So if we want to say, when I'm generating an IPS within Canada, I want it to meet both the IPS constraints on patient and the national constraints on patient. That's the challenge that we're coming up against. And that's what this mechanism is supposed to address. We can't make, we can't say CA baseline derives from IPS, and we can't say IPS derives from CA baseline, and our PSCA derives from both, or from that chain, because there isn't a way to structure it. And that's what this is intended to address.
Rita, does that kind of answer your question? Because there may actually, like, multi-inheritance is a case that's been required to solve this particular challenge, which is you've got an international thing that you want to derive from and a national set of core constraints. But it's also common in other business workflows where you might want to be able to merge different distinct sets of rules together into a single profile.
I'm trying to say that whatever you're doing here needs to meet the requirements of this IHE profile and this, and say US core.
So I think we talked through a couple examples where that might be more likely to come up. So, having to manage, essentially distinct expectations and rules for things like patient address, name. We talked about terminology. We started talking about invariance. I think that with impose, the execution of X or Y or Z invariance, in either case, like, I don't actually think it matters if you check this invariant before this one, because in either case, if it doesn't match both, it's not compliant to this. So we can certainly explore the invariant one more commonly. The places where we typically have invariants in the base have been in name and I think maybe address. I tried to pull those out where I could, but like, effectively, I think we know that there are going to be places where it might be valuable to try to distribute our expectations. Like, what else do we need to see to feel good about saying, okay, like, we want to use impose profile. I'd like to be able to make the case to say a really good way of ensuring that the core stays in sync with the base is to ask for it in impose profile, for it to impose the base. What other types of things that we want to explore before we feel confident being like, yeah, that is what we want to ask for. That is what we want to recommend. So we heard rendering was one. Like, we want to make sure that we're able to see, like, and acknowledge the impacts of both rendering and validation. Are there other things? I think if not, like, what I would say is, we talked through some scenarios. We could talk about trying them out in actual, like, JSON examples, but the second piece that we wanted to make sure we start talking through, in addition to like, we've been spending time on obligations, we've been spending time on impose, with this desire to say, hey, here's maybe the ways that we can try to have a mechanical recommendation in place for when the core profiles come. The other thing that we do have to work through is how do we make sure the changes are in place to make it so that a mechanical pointer could be made because the core or the base is appropriately updated and it's got some of the changes that we've already decisioned already baked in. So are folks comfortable putting a pause on this and talking a little bit about our changelog? Anyone not comfortable switching over and talking about our changelog? Okay. So I'm going to just quickly show you guys, just do a really quick walkthrough of how one would go about kind of raising their hand and making a change associated with an issue that we've already dispositioned. So part of a larger call that we're going to start making and working through on the governance side of things to get more editors in so that we can have help actually putting in changes that have already been agreed upon. So I have the QA new branch up in the CA baseline GitHub. It's a public GitHub, and you should be able to find it here. Anyone can be a contributor. I contribute my changes through QA new because the master is what builds automatically to this build.fhir.org. And so if we make a mistake in what we pull in, it takes that one down. So you'd go to QA new. You would, let's say you want to either clone it, or the fastest way I've done it is I just open up this in GitHub desktop and it creates a local copy of this branch on my desktop. And then when I make changes in my GitHub desktop, like I have been trying to do in the last couple of days, I can see CA baseline. This is the repo in my local. This is the branch. And each time I click save in my QA, or sorry, in my GitHub desktop interface, I can see, okay, this is what I've made a change to from what exists on the internet for this branch. And when I'm ready to contribute that change, I click, that's the file I want to contribute. And normally, I've been doing some troubleshooting, but normally what it would say would be push origin, or sorry, it would be commit new and then push origin. So effectively what cloning and working on QA new can do is just allow for you to have a space where you can play, apply changes, and have those pushed up in a way that once it's been pushed, we can have folks like myself or other volunteers look at those and make sure that, yep, it looks good, and push it through. And it's a way that we distribute ownership and we distribute the maintenance of trying to get some of our outstanding questions or outstanding changes done, where someone might only have to, for instance, I pulled out a really easy one, update an extension typo. Super easy, right? Like, it's for this one, the question is, do we need an uppercase on extension individual deceased? So if I was, let me actually open up my resources. I think I might have actually, in trying to troubleshoot some of what I'm looking at, taken it out temporarily. Let me see if I can pull it up and show it to you guys. Where is that? This isn't exactly the same view, but effectively, you would just go through and make the change, right? So if the extension individual is deceased or not, save it and push it up in your version of the build. And there's a lot of, like, I think there's a handful of typos that we could probably pretty quickly work through, or even like categorize for folks to pick up. But I did want to just like, there are simple things that it would be incredibly, incredibly meaningful to have folks just tackling, because we have a lot of issues left in the log that, like, even the ones that we know these are ready to be applied. Hold on, this is that we just haven't had time to actually go through. So like, it very clearly says, make this change, and it would be wonderful. And I'm pleased, if you're interested in doing this, please reach out. I'm willing to do the more wholesome walkthrough with you folks, but it's also a really good opportunity to play around more than just what we get to do on the baseline calls with the baseline itself. There were a couple that I wanted to bring up today. So there's one that I think should be relatively quick, which is good because I think we're running out of time, which is the service language extension. So this is the issue. And it's an issue on the extension, which is service language that we currently have posted in the baseline. So the question is, should it be on healthcare services? And it says as opposed to location. Is it possible for the location to provide multiple services, not all of which are necessarily delivered in the same language? So let's go to look at the extension. So the extension is placed on, let me just look at the JSON. Organization, location, and healthcare service. So the person is asking whether or not, should it not be on healthcare service as opposed to location? So I think I interpret this issue as removing location so that it's really just service languages on health service. Is that how others read this request?
Unless they missed that it was on healthcare service.
Yeah, I think you would normally use it on healthcare service because location to me, you know, particularly as we would talk through, you know, like in BC, how we're modeling clinics, services, and locations, you know, the service piece comes in at the organization and the service. So I think that's where you'd normally use it. I don't know that we would necessarily, we might have put it on location because there's some places where that makes sense. I don't think in the context where I'm working that we would put it against location, but that's just only one narrow use case, right?
Are there others that would be using it within location, or that would see value in maintaining our ability to continue using that extension in the future in location?
Yeah, I mean, I can see a value on location. Everything provided at this location is available in these languages, or something like that. So I don't think it makes sense to prohibit it on location. However, you know, we haven't been clear what it means to say, you know, if a location speaks 3 languages and a service at that location only speaks 1, or vice versa, what does that mean? And how should you resolve those differences? We haven't discussed that.
And how do we resolve the difference between the organization that's at a location and the location itself, right? So there's a bunch of nuances there.
Yeah, but I think the extension should be capable of being on all of those things. And it would be up to an IG to say, for our purpose, we're going to tag services with languages.
Yeah, Elliot, I agree. I don't think we should constrain that at the baseline level. I mean, it's something that I don't see in the context of IGs I'm working on that we could use there. That doesn't mean other people shouldn't.
So would you say, are you saying it would be, but an implementer, you said flag instead of constrain? Like,
An implementation guide, not an implementer.
an implementation guide is encouraged
Not
to
even is free to.
constrain
Yeah.
or to identify?
I mean, I don't think it's even constrained, right? So the extension is available on any of those three entities. An implementation guide may express where they want to use, which entity they wish to use the extension on in their context. Is that a great way to paraphrase what you said, Elliot?
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually what we're saying is we don't want to make a change.
Yeah. Or is there anyone that would be against that action item or like response to the individual, which is we should consider making a change and we should further discuss what change that would be?
What?
I'm asking whether or not we can consider this an action item, or sorry, not an action item, but like a response that we can close out to the requester, or if we need further discussion, if anyone feels that we need further discussion, because we
Yeah,
may
she's
wanna
asking if
consider it.
anybody disagrees with us that we actually should change it.
Got it. Okay.
So no one feels that there's a further need for discussion? Okay. Okay, I'm just finishing up this sentence. And free to express expectations for which wishers they wish to see the extension used on. So basically like at this time, we won't apply a further change unless further clarification is provided.
If I was sitting in an HL7 meeting, I would say we'd move to find it not persuasive with an explanation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that we just don't have the original requester here, and like we didn't really give them an opportunity to further clarify, because if I was doing a triage process correctly, I probably would have done that. Are folks comfortable with this, just to give them that opportunity to like further clarify if this, if they desire to appeal?
Motion denied without prejudice.
All right. I will then stop sharing. I'll stop recording. And I think that for the next few profiling sessions, we're just going to keep moving through the community issue log, and hopefully I will have gotten through the error that I'm troubleshooting and we can just start applying changes online. Hopefully, we'll see. If there's anyone who knows how to solve this issue, please let me know, because I have been working on it since Monday. So.